So we pick it back up here on Eastern Christianity, which I decided to make into a separate lecture, or part 2 of the Christianity lecture, since you're really covering 4 days on this subject, and the East and West churches really are so different in terms of the type of conversation we're going to have here. Eastern Christianity you could divide into Eastern Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. In Catholicism, we're going to talk about Catholic rites. In Orthodoxy, we're going to talk about Orthodox churches. So what is an Orthodox church? This is one of the groups that split off during the 1054 Great Schism I mentioned in the other lecture. The Orthodox were not affected by the Protestant Reformation, but rather they really continued to represent a very early strand of Christianity, and they're very proud of this. Many of them think that Rome has developed too much and evolved. Their primary issue with the Catholic Church, which is the continued source of schism, is the rejection of the Pope's juridical authority over the whole Church. They do not believe that the Bishop of Rome should have the power to make decisions for the whole Church, though they do view the Bishop of Rome as the quote-unquote first among equals, or figurehead among the bishops. Unlike Protestant churches, which the Vatican documents refer to as ecclesiastical communities, as we saw at the beginning of the course, Orthodox churches are bona fide churches because they possess the fullness of what it means to be a church. Namely, they have valid sacraments, they have apostolic succession, and they have the Eucharist. There are differences in how they go about doing these things, but they have the same fundamental beliefs about the body and blood of Jesus, and they really can trace their bishops back to the early apostles and Jesus. And they have all 7 sacraments. In point of fact, the Vatican documents make it clear that in the case of an emergency, you could actually receive the Eucharist at an Orthodox church. But the caveat there is they also have to allow you to do it. So let's say you're in a country where there's no Catholic church. If you go to them and ask whether you can receive before the liturgy and they allow you, then you can. Now we're going to distinguish Orthodox churches from Catholic rites. People who belong to different Catholic rites are in communion with Rome. But these rites you go to may look the exact same in appearance to a Orthodox church. And I'll show you many pictures here later because pictures are the way to illustrate this. A rite is defined as a practical liturgical arrangement or a practical tradition which varies by community. A different rite will be headed by a patriarch. For example, you have the patriarch of the Antiochian rite, or of the Melkite rite, or Byzantine rite. That's the head bishop. The same rite can be used by Catholics and Orthodox, and this is one of the main sources of confusion. The Byzantine rite people will throw around is a way of celebrating the sacraments. It's a specific liturgy which uses different words and gestures and the like from the Mass. But the Orthodox will use it and Catholics will use it, and the only main difference might be that the Catholics pray for the intentions of the Pope. So walking in on a superficial level to a church you can't tell necessarily. There are 22 plus rites in the Catholic Church. I've given you a link to the EWTN library which goes through these, and it's very interesting to take a look at just some of the different examples and get a feel for them. I'll talk about Pope Benedict on rites here in a few minutes, but he breaks them down into their basic families, and they're really based on the primatial sees, that is to say the earliest main centers of Christianity. You have Rome, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and Byzantium, which later became Constantinople. And then within each one of those, you have different families. So within the Byzantine, if you're in Ukraine, it's the Ukrainian rite, or in Greece, they have their own rite, or whatever country, there'll be all kinds of different rites within the Byzantine. And that's where you get to that number of 22 different rites. How do you get to so many rites in the church? It's actually not a bad thing, it's a good thing. Because when the apostles went and evangelized, they didn't have the internet back then. So they all developed their own traditions of how to say the liturgy. In the West, in Rome, it became known as the Mass because it was from the Latin missa, where we get the name Mass. But in the Byzantine Rite, they call it the Divine Liturgy. And there's a Divine Liturgy based on the church doctor St. John Chrysostom, called the Divine Liturgy of John Chrysostom, as well as the Liturgy of St. Basil and others like that. So each apostle goes off, evangelizes, they reach the people in different ways, and that's the source of the different rites. But it's amazing that they still have the same essence, despite their lack of communication with one another. That's the miracle of it. There are three main areas of difference among the different rites. First of all, you have the ecclesiastical disciplines and juridical governance. In Rome and in the West, which traditionally would include all of Europe, but now most people in America and other places have been evangelized by the Italians and by the Romans, we have ultimately the Bishop of Rome in charge. And he ultimately dictates who the bishops are by means of papal nuncios or appointed bishops in different countries which advise him. But in the different rites, for example, let's take the Coptics. They have their own pope, they call him, not to counter the Romans, but because that was just a name, who runs the show and pretty much makes the calls. But in other traditions, you'll have a patriarch who will work with other bishops. And it depends on who you're talking to and which group. Needless to say, there are many different types of disciplines, and that accounts for one of the main distinctions between the rites. Two is their theologies differ. I mentioned the filioque. A document I'll mention later on here has come about from the dialogues between the Catholics and Orthodox, which has led us to realize that we really do believe the same thing about the procession of the Holy Spirit, to the point where Byzantine Catholic rites, when you go to their liturgy, they don't have to say the filioque, the "and from the Son" part, because the Pope recognizes that they are saying the same thing, even though theologically their argument is different. And then finally, the different rites have different spiritual and liturgical patrimonies. Liturgical, I just talked about a little bit, and then spiritual too. The notion of theosis or divinization, as I mentioned, is something that's more in the East. In the West, we talk more about justification. In the West, we have the Rosary. In the East, they have the Jesus Prayer, which they repeat. And those are just a couple examples of difference. Now I'll give you a couple examples from the Catholic rites, and I gave you links you can click to after lecture if you'd like. In the Roman Rite, which we call the Holy Mass, we actually have two forms, and then the Anglican use, which I mentioned earlier. The ordinary form is the Mass of Vatican II, which almost everybody hearing this lecture who's Catholic would have grown up with. And that's what anybody will hear if they go to a normal Catholic church today. The extraordinary form, also called the Vetus Ordo or Old Form, is the Tridentine Mass. And you still can say that. In fact, Pope Benedict issued a document which allows any Catholic priest to say it if he learns it. But it's extraordinary because it's outside of the norm. You're not supposed to do that unless there's a community who's prepared to understand it, unless they ask for it, and it is allowed but not the normal path. Then, as I mentioned, in the Byzantine Rite, you have the Divine Liturgy, and I have a link to that. And then I'm going to spend some time a little bit on the Syro-Malabar Rite in India, and they call it the Holy Qurbana. If you had to pick any of these links, please click on the Holy Qurbana later, because you'll hear the preface to the Eucharistic prayer and how the priest chants it. And if you pay attention to his words, many are very similar to what we have. And they have the Holy, 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 but instead of bells, they have these kind of metal leaf things they shake to make noise. And the chanting is extremely beautiful. Now, for a couple more words from Pope Benedict on the rites. I already mentioned the different divisions and how we got to those. I shouldn't say divisions, really, different distinctions between the rites. But I also want to say a thing about the, let's say, the you know what? Actually, guys, sorry about that. I'm going to skip that part since I already basically talked about what I wanted to. So skip that last 30 seconds. We can turn now to what I want to do on the different images that distinguish Eastern and Western traditions. And here you're going to see a lot of different images from my travels, which again I think are one of the best ways to explain Eastern versus Western Catholicism and Orthodoxy. This first picture you have here is a picture of the Annunciation to Mary. And Mary's down here at a well. This is an icon outside of the Church of the Annunciation, which is the Orthodox Church, where Mary is said to have received the message from the Archangel Gabriel. And here you have within the picture an iconostasis, an icon stand. You see a guy standing up at a lectern doing a reading. They're doing some kind of liturgy, probably a liturgy of the hours. But that iconostasis or icon stand traditionally separates off the sanctuary where the priest sacrifices the Mass from the people. And that's not intended to keep the people out, but to show the mystery of what's going on. This next picture is the group going down towards the end of this hallway and down some stairs where there is the well, which is said to have been the well where Mary was when she received the Annunciation. Now that maybe I'll find it interesting, but it gets really interesting when you go to this next picture, which is the Catholic site of the Annunciation. And the picture doesn't really give you a sense of the depth completely, but this is pretty far down where you're walking around this whole church and you descend down the steps on the far left of the picture. As you get down there at the bottom, you have a little tiny chapel, as you see here, and then zoom in on the altar, and you have this picture, verbum caro hic factum est. The Word was made flesh here, hic. Because it's on that site that the tradition says that the Annunciation took place. So which is it? Is it the Catholic site or the Orthodox site? They're probably within a mile of each other. And as I mentioned to you earlier in the course, the Holy Land Guide, if he's good, will probably tell you, well, it's pretty close, whichever it is. At any rate, outside that Church of the Annunciation, one neat thing you'll see is they have all these different images of Mary from all over the nations, and I just picked a couple to show you here. For example, you have the picture of Mary from China and how the different nations relate to Mary, really demonstrating the universality of the Roman Catholic Church. This is a picture of the Holy Sepulchre, the basilica where Christ died, was buried, and rose, which they built over those sites. And this is the approach you make to it when you come off of the way of the cross. And this picture here is taken in front of Golgotha. There's my wife and kid in the front. In the background, you have this guy standing, and there's a place where you go and kneel down and you can touch the site where the cross was. But the Holy Sepulchre is a real flashpoint in terms of the division between Catholics and Orthodox, because different churches, such as the Armenians and Byzantines and Roman Catholics, are in charge of different parts of the basilica. And there's a story here about this ladder you see on the facade. And the story goes something like this. I forgot the details, but that ladder's been there for decades because they can't move it. For one group can't go and claim that that facade is their portion of the basilica. They don't agree who has the rights to that facade. And if one group moves it, it might be an offense to another. And if the one group takes it down, maybe that's saying to the others, well, now you can do what you want with it. It's just a whole mess. And there's literally even been fighting between priests of the different churches in that church. I put up a few links to different Eastern chants, too, to give you a sense of the universality of the church. This Byzantine Ani Parthene Despina is one of the most beautiful Marian hymns. And if I put that up and didn't give you the words or pictures, you might think it's Muslim, because it's got this haunting, beautiful text. And there's a bass guy that keeps the low note called an eson, and it's ethereal. And then the Akatist hymn is also a famous Byzantine Marian liturgy. And then there's an Arabic one I put up there, a Syriac Hail Mary, and an Arabic Christmas carol. Now we'll turn to architecture. This is quintessential Western architecture from Chartres in France. And you see here on the right the picture of the rose glass and the Gothic steeples. On the left, I just wanted to show you this, which you can't, again, fully appreciate from my kind of grainy photo, but they have a thing in the summer in Chartres called Chartres en Lumière, Chartres in light, and they actually put up colored lights on the facade of these basilicas to light up the different statues and carvings and give you an idea what it might look like when many of these buildings were painted back in the day. Then here you have Hagia Sophia, which you've seen before. If you look at that, you might think that's a different church completely. There's a picture of our group that was in front of it. Hopefully I'll get to lead that trip again someday, and if I do, look out for that. And then next we have an interior shot of the Hagia Sophia with those Arabic signs and calligraphy. But at the very top center between those two, you can see an icon of Jesus and Mary, and that's over where the main altar would have been. This picture here is from behind Hagia Sophia in a church called Hagia Irene, which was the site of the Council of Constantinople in 381. Still very well preserved. And I like this picture here, an icon inside of Hagia Sophia, because you have Mary and Jesus here being handed the church, and I think this is the state represented on the right. You have the Emperor Justinian, and I believe the other one, I had to go back and look, is St. Andrew. But the point is that Mary's being offered church and state here in Hagia Sophia. In this picture, we have an overview of the island of Patmos. And I'm putting this up here because it's on eastern soil. Patmos is an island of Greece just right outside of Turkey. And you don't think of Turkey as Christian today, but it was very Christian. And while Catholics can visit this place, it is run by the Orthodox. And there's an icon here you'll see of St. John receiving his revelation. He's dictating it to his scribe named Prochoros, with the cave where he was and receiving it in the background there, which is black. And the bottom right picture is the actual cave where John is said to have received the revelation. The Orthodox tradition is also important because they're in charge of sites like Mary's house and the tomb of St. John the Apostle, which you can see here. That's all that's left of it on the left. And back behind where it's curved, that would have been where the altar and apse was. And you have a few pillars left. On the right of that, you have the reconstruction of what that magnificent church would have looked like. Here in Ephesus, you have the famous Temple of Artemis, where Paul preached, and people shouted him down, saying, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And that's in Turkey. Here's a picture of Artemis herself and her many breasts that are represented there. So Paul had to fight against this pagan worship. And that's all near the same area. And again, if you're a Roman Catholic, you might not make a pilgrimage there, but that's some of the most important history of Christianity. And it behooves us to breathe with both lungs and to kind of learn from the Orthodox and reacquaint ourselves with that. Another great thing about Orthodoxy is their monasteries. This is from a famous mountain range in Greece called Meteora. There's also Mount Athos, some of you may have heard of. Just these series of monasteries built up impossibly on top of these mountain peaks. And here's a picture to show you Orthodox culture. This is a chapel inside a train station, of all places. Don't see that in America, do you? And the churches have wonderful architecture. So here's the famous churches you've seen on postcards probably before from Santorini. And they have the blue and white and the domed roofs. And they're just these little quaint churches, just like you'll see if you go into Italy, a tiny church on every street corner. So there's a lot of similarity there as well, but just the architecture I've been talking about is different. And this next one I've chosen because I want you to try to guess where this church is from for a second. It has the rounded domes, but it also has the spires. If you're thinking in terms of domes and east and spires as west, well, guess what? This is Poland. It's Krakow. And this is St. Stanislaus Cathedral. So the Balkans and then also Eastern Europe up to Poland and Ukraine and those type of countries, they have a kind of mixture midway between east and west, you observe. Now we're going to go to a different type of orthodoxy, and that is in India. I mentioned the travel of St. Thomas the Apostle and talking about Judaism, how there was an early Jewish community there that he would have ran into. Well, Thomas is said to have traveled to and been martyred in South India, and in fact, the evidence for that is about as good as there is evidence for any of the apostles' final resting place besides maybe Peter and Paul. You have here a map of the travels and routes of Thomas the Apostle that he could have gone through. This is the site where he was martyred, up on top of the hill overlooking the city of Chennai. And you have there a cross of Christ with above it a little cross, which represents Thomas's sacrifice as a share in Christ. Then here, like you see in the Holy Land, you have this awning and then various plaques outside of it, which has the words "My Lord and my God" in various languages to show the universality of the church, even though this is a site which was the source of division between Orthodox and Catholics. So you have "My Lord and my God," and then the Romance languages, and here in the Indian languages such as Hindi, and here you have it in the ancient languages, Syriac, Aramaic, which Jesus spoke, and Greek. And take a look at these churches and their architecture. This is an Orthodox church where St. Thomas is said to have founded the place. It's not the same building anymore. You can see it's pretty modern, but it's really colorful. And here's the inside of it with typical Indian color, and the priest showing us a relic of St. Thomas. And down here you have a church built by the Portuguese in the late 1400s, which contains what used to be the tomb of Vasco da Gama. And this is around the time of Columbus, like I said, but it is the Portuguese, who were Roman Catholics, who came and took over the lands, and they did not understand what was going on there. This goes to show our nearsightedness sometimes. We think that Roman Catholicism equals Catholicism. So they go there and they really force the locals to change some of their traditions, and we've lost a lot of what they originally had. In fact, one of the biggest things that saddened me about going to India was I couldn't find any good icons to take back home because they've lost that liturgical art tradition. But here you have a kind of a funny picture of me sipping a coconut they gave us. They're very hospitable with the patriarchs of the Syro-Malabar Church up there, and you can see their hats and everything look different than ours, but those are actually Catholics. And then here's the picture of the cardinal of the Syro-Malankara Church, who took time to be with us for probably 15 minutes. And he looks very much what you'd expect of in a Roman priest. And in fact, he had just gotten back that day from a trip to Rome. And then there was a priest named Father Matthew who showed us around and said a liturgy or a kurbana for us. And you see this big veil here. That's what they have instead of an iconostasis. At certain points in the liturgy, that veil will open up and you can see what's going on in the sanctuary, and at certain points you'll close it. Again, much like you see in an iconostasis, such as this church here, which is the church of St. Titus in Crete. There are doors there in the middle that they'll open up to show you. And then here is Father Matthew showing us the St. Thomas cross, which is unique because it has a lotus flower underneath it. You see those two things sticking up. When you evangelize other countries, you make use of their national symbols and heritages. So the lotus, being the national flower of India, shows that the cross is planted there, reaches out to the four corners of the world, but it's firmly rooted in India. And along with that, you have Father Matthew. See, his back is towards us. In the Eastern liturgies, the priest faces the same direction as the people. It's not that he has his back to the people, like sometimes people say, but you're all facing God together, and he's offering the sacrifice on your behalf. This one I thought was neat because it's Saint Therese, a very Western saint, a French saint, and you see a lot of Western art in their churches. This is outside the Syro-Malabar Cathedral, very beautiful. And here's a sign at a place where there was an appearance of Mary, which they called the Lourdes of the East. This buttermilk vendor boy was cured, and they built this chapel here for him. Again, looks very Western. And that's a site called Our Lady of Valankany, which is really interesting to visit there. So Lourdes is great, but there's a whole other tradition, which is arguably just as important as Lourdes, that most Roman Catholics don't even know about. But you go to some of these sites like Velankini, and it's on the coast, but look how trashy this is. Not all of India is like this, but it goes to show the poverty. And then here's your typical toilet. I just had to throw this in here to show you a little bit of culture. That's what you have to go to the bathroom in a lot in India and take a shower in that same area. That bucket's for showering. Another interesting thing I found going back to liturgy is you have to take off your shoes. And this is something I was looking forward to figure out whether we'd have to do or not, because when you go into a mosque or a Hindu temple, usually you have to remove your shoes. In India, for churches, you generally do too, because that's just the custom of the country. Like you saw that picture of the icon and the chapel in the Orthodox train station, in South India, you'll see Marian statues in restaurants, such as this great restaurant we ate some fish in here. India is such a great place to visit for many reasons, but it's also cheap for Americans to travel to, and I had some of the best fish of my life for probably $3 there. And lastly, for India, you have where Mother Teresa was, founded her order, and this is entering the side to her church, kind of a nondescript alley in Calcutta, and the sisters keep it very simple, but you can go in there and pray at the tomb of Mother Teresa. They change the saying on the tomb every day with flowers. This is "Be my fire of love." The next day it would say "I thirst," which was her calling. She received the revelation from Jesus to quench his thirst in the people who are dying. So the Indians call their place God's own country, and I hope you've enjoyed seeing some of those pictures to that effect. We come now to a discussion of iconography. Iconography is the quintessential Eastern Christian way of picturing or portraying the saints and mysteries of the faith. In West, we tend to be realist in the sense that we like to try to paint people or sculpt them as literally as they would appear according to artistic ability. But in the East, they deliberately do not do that. This is a famous icon or image of the Trinity. It's a Trinity in which the Trinity prefigured itself to Abraham when he was met by the three mysterious men and Isaac's birth is announced miraculously. And they're receiving there a kind of meal which foreshadows the Holy Mass. They like symbolism, so Rublev's Trinity has three chalices. The little chalice, which is the one on the table. Then there's one made out by their legs, the interior of the two angels there on the left and right. Then the whole thing kind of makes a chalice. So they like the symbols of three. St. John of Damascus, a church father, the same one that responded to Islam, wrote a work called Three Treatises on the Divine Images, because there was a heresy called iconoclasm, which prompted the very last ecumenical council that we share with Orthodox, the Seventh Council, which was at Nicaea. So the Second Council of Nicaea, the last ecumenical council. And the church fathers decided you can make images because God himself has become incarnate. And so we ought to portray that. But you should recognize that you really can't portray the divine nature. And Jews and Muslims are right. We can give analogies and images about God insofar as he's become incarnate. In the Old Testament, they forbid the making of images because God didn't want to be worshipped as an idol like the other nations. So still, there can be a temptation towards superstition, like Pope Benedict says, and therefore we don't say we worship images, but we do venerate images. We honor them. And Easterns will sometimes kiss them in a kind of way that we would kiss the cross on Good Friday. And they have a sacramental type of sense, such as we call the sacramentals of holy water. Benedict says that icons require of us a different type of vision to understand them. They require a fast from the eyes, an asceticism. They're not photographs, but they reveal something deeper about God than a simple picture would. you see there's supposed to be windows into heaven. And in doing that, they'll portray a theological point rather than just a physical point. Here's a picture of them making an icon, and how you can see there's an outline, and then the other ones beside it are complete. Technically, you don't paint one, you write an icon. It's an act of the logos, or word. It's an act of prayer and reason. A few illustrations. This here on the left is the baptism of Jesus, and you see within that there are several different scenes portrayed. You have the Magi and you have the angels, and all of that put into one, including Joseph at the bottom left being tempted by Satan to let Mary go or turn her in or something for fornicating because she had this baby out of wedlock. Baby Jesus is wrapped really tightly in swaddling clothes, and that prefigures his death. He looks like a little mummy Jesus. And look what he's sitting in. He's sitting in a cave, which foreshadows his death. The meaning of the icon, if we fast with our eyes and remain with it and meditate on it, is that even in Jesus' birth, he's already began the process of dying. He's already sacrificing himself and becoming completely one with us. On the right, we have his baptism, which conveys a similar point. The baptism waters also form a kind of tomb. And the baptism indeed is Jesus' death to himself, so to speak, whereby he shares in our own death and puts to death all of our own vices and is going to raise them up and purify us so that we become new creatures. So that's just one little aspect that's neat. And then you also have here the resurrection of Jesus, which I alluded to in discussing the afterlife in Judaism. Jesus raises Adam and Eve from the dead, and that's a prefigurement of what will happen to all of us on the last day. He breaks the bars of death, and all the little nuts and bolts there in the black represent Jesus conquering death, and he binds up Satan and death, who's personified as a figure here. So those are just a few of my favorite icons in the East. And then lastly, in terms of explaining the meaning of different ones, here's a triptych, which is 3 icons together. It has the resurrection scene I just talked about, but it has 2 angels on the side. And this is meant to represent, it's a kind of new Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant in the Old Testament contained God's presence. Well, here you have Jesus, the incarnate God, who's flanked by the 2 cherubim. And take a look at this church here, which is a church in Constantinople, and you can see how it's worn out now because it's 1,500 years old and hasn't been taken care of because of foreign occupation. But they would paint the whole church in icons, top to bottom. And the right picture shows how many of them were covered over, and now they've uncovered some of them. The last topic is theology of East versus West. And I'm going to just give you a couple of theologians to consider. One of them is Pseudo-Dionysius. He's called pseudo because people originally attribute him to the Dionysius of Acts chapter 17, who was converted upon Paul's preaching in Athens, as is pictured here. But this church father actually lived in the 6th century AD, and he gives us a great insight into how the Easterns understand God. His mysticism is one of divinization or theosis, but it's critical because it's not the same as being absorbed as it is in Hinduism. And this is my favorite topic on Eastern theology because you really see how Hindus are maybe onto something about God and mysticism. They understand that we become God in some way, but here's what they miss. We have to draw a distinction between created and uncreated. We are created. Hindus believe we are uncreated. We're made out of nothing. So we don't earn our salvation. We don't earn being God. Second, we distinguish nature from grace. For a Hindu, you are by nature God. You've just forgotten it. But for us, you get that appropriated by God's gift or grace. So St. Athanasius, the father of the First Council of Nicaea, states it this way: God became man so that we might become God. And church fathers will put it in various ways, so that some will say the Son of God became man so that the sons of men might become the sons of God. That's a little bit less, a little more safer way of putting it, if you will. Blessed Marmion, very much later, famously says that we become by grace what Christ is by nature, the Son of God. But I hope you get the point. We take on God's own attributes. I'll give you one more image from that. This is from St. John of Damascus again. He says, we are iron, we're cold by nature. But if we're put into the flame of God's love, we light up. And we take on God's own properties if we remain immersed in the fire of his love. So that we begin to burn with his own love and his own knowledge. And we can go in turn and burn things ourselves. We become cooperators with God through his grace. But that's only to the extent that we remain united in God and remain in his love. If we're taken out of the fire again, we are returning back to our cold nature and can't burn things anymore. This mysticism leads into the notion of apophaticism in Pseudo-Dionysius. This is also something very relevant to Eastern religions. Dionysius says that God is, quote, beyond being, which is not a very precise way to put it. Aquinas will later tweak him on this, but it's the notion of negative theology, or coming to God through negating what he is not. In fact, Aquinas goes so far as to say we can't know the essence of God in this life, we can only know what he is not. We don't have the beatific vision yet. This is just another way of saying something that the Eastern religions say, namely that God is so far beyond us, he appears as darkness. And that's why Benedict XVI in his Catechesis on Dionysius calls us a great dialogue point. And why John Paul says the church can learn to breathe with both lungs of East and West by appropriating this and realizing how limited our concepts of God really are and how much we really need to bow down in the presence of him. The other church father of the East I want to talk about is St. Maximus the Confessor, who has a great name, first of all, but he was born in 580 and martyred alongside Pope Martin I for his refusal to accept a heresy called monothelitism, which said that Christ only had one will. He ends up vindicated at the Third Council of Constantinople, which was not an ecumenical council. Actually, let me fact check that, guys. Actually, I think it was. Sorry about that. But anyway, he was vindicated at Constantinople III. And Maximus is good because he's a bridge between the East and Western churches. Many Western people appreciate him as well. For example, Hans Urs von Balthasar wrote important work on Maximus, and he's beginning to be more popular again. He has this notion called the logoi. The logoi are the intelligible models of creatures such as they exist in God eternally. You have always existed in a manner of speaking, Maximus says. The one logos is many logoi. Let me comment on this for a second. God is word, God is reason, logos. But logoi is the plural of that in Greek. So the one logos is many logoses. That means that you have a place in God's own heart and mind from all eternity. He knows what he wants you to become. And you participate in God proportionate to your virtue. The more you become the fullest version of yourself and you take on his own plan for you, you exist and participate more in God. Our goal in life is to return to this model God has in mind, to discover his vocation for you, to fully live your life in accordance with his will. And that's how you return to that model that he had for you before you were even created. Maximus comments on St. Gregory the Nazianzen, who says that each being is called and indeed is a portion of God. And that sounds kind of heretical at first. That's why he dedicates a whole document to try to explain what that means. In his response, he says, "It is by grace that man is God and called God." And he puts it into this great formula: by this blessed inversion, man is made God by divinization, and God made man by hominization. God comes down to earth. He descends. He joins in our human nature through his birth, his baptism, as we see in the icons, ultimately his death and resurrection. Through that dissension, he then joins us, and we ascend to God and come back up to him and are divinized precisely to the extent that we share in his own passion, death, and resurrection. In the Mass, you see this prayer. By the mystery of this water and wine, may we come to share in the divinity of Christ, who humbled himself to share in our humanity. What is happening there when the priest says the prayer? He's pouring a little bit of water into the wine. The water symbolizing us entering into the wine of Christ and merging and becoming completely one. The analogy only goes so far because we remain distinct. We don't become a blob of God, but we become fully ourselves when we give away ourselves. We don't lose our identity in a sort of dreamless sleep state that you see in Hinduism. Rather, we are most fully aware and most fully afire with love when we are divinized by God. And you see this in all of the great Western mystics later, John of the Cross being the foremost among them. The last thing to talk about within this theology is our relationship with the Orthodox from an ecumenical perspective. And so let me make a couple of comments on what the state of affairs is now in case you're ever interested in following up on this. The key Catholic principles, as we saw already in Lutheranism, are the Decree on Ecumenism from Vatican II, and there's also one called the Decree on the Eastern Churches, which is very helpful. John Paul II's Ut Unum Sint, I mentioned before, speaks to both Eastern and Western ecumenism. But John Paul also has a document called Orientale Lumen, which deals with Eastern churches. And in there, John Paul II makes it very clear that the Eastern churches have a right to govern themselves. We shouldn't impose upon them anything more beyond what is essential, quoting the Acts of the Apostles 15:28 there. So they should be allowed to have a certain independence as long as they're in communion with Rome. And you know, one of the things that Pope Benedict says on that subject is people go and create new churches and schisms because there's supposed to be a certain unity within diversity in the Catholic faith. But when Rome sometimes makes it impossible to have that, people go looking for the diversity outside the church. So we don't want to absorb the other churches, as John Paul and Benedict and now Francis both all say, but we want them to be unified with us. So the North American Orthodox Catholic Consultation, which is a very important dialogue that's ongoing, has a document called the Filioque, a church dividing issue I assigned, where we agree that we basically have the same understanding of it. But I hope you appreciated learning the history of that and reading on it, because it's a fascinating and really convoluted history. The other document is called Steps Towards a United Church, where they go through practicals of what we need to take place in order to achieve a state of receiving sacraments with one another and being in full communion. And then there's the Orthodox Catholic Joint International Commission, which has a number of important documents, and I'll just mention one thing about them here at the last slide. The last word then is, what will the shape of full visible communion look like if we achieve it? And Pope Francis is very confident that we will achieve it. Number one, we will have accepted diversity, a unity in diversity where we recognize the orthodoxy, that is the correctness of one another's different expressions of the one faith. They will accept that our developments since the Seventh Ecumenical Council are not heretical. We will recognize they don't have to fully state everything the way we state it. Number two, we will have liturgical sharing. We're sister churches. We'll be able to go to an Orthodox church, they can come to a Catholic church. Three, synodality or conciliarity, which means we'll have synods or councils, conciliar, together and fully share in judgments being made with the recognition of the Pope being at the head somehow, which we'll discuss in a second. A common mission next. So doing works of charity together, evangelizing together. Subsidiarity means that we will allow the Eastern churches to govern themselves, as I said before. And Vatican II and the recent popes are very open to that. But the last thing has to deal with the papacy. What will be the role of the papacy? There's an unfinished joint document from the International Orthodox Catholic Dialogue, which has been worked on for several years and is up to be discussed again shortly, which still doesn't have an answer to that question. It's clear that he's the first among equals. It's clear he has some power, that the early church made appeals to the Pope of Rome to help settle disputes. It's not clear in the 21st century what his role will be, and that's what's being discussed. But there's this thing called the Ratzinger formula, which the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity has made a big deal out of, and which is really helpful, in which Ratzinger said, we should not impose upon the Orthodox any more than was decided upon in the first millennium, that is, before the schism. And that goes to show how open the Catholic Church and her hierarchy is, and how much we really want full visible communion, that we're not going to impose all the developments that we've made, as long as we can come to an agreement that we're saying the same essential thing. We want them to maintain their traditions, to have the beauty of their liturgy and their theology, so that the church may breathe again with both lungs, be resplendent, and have all one body in Christ. So that's the end of the course. We've gone through an entire overview of the Catholic Church's view of non-Christian religions and of the different Christian sects, different Christian divisions, different Christian churches, in as much as we can in an intensive summer class like this. You have a comprehensive study guide for the exam, as I've said on Blackboard. You have your assignments that are due, and it's all clearly marked on the schedule. And we have, of course, the discussion forums and email and office hours and all these things we can do to communicate and help wrap up this semester properly. But I hope you've enjoyed listening to the lectures. I hope they've been accurate. I hope they've been ordered, and I hope you've enjoyed the illustrations from pictures and art and links. If you see any errors that need corrected in any of these, such as mistimings or miscues or something, please let me know, so this will help out in the future. But it's been a pleasure. I look forward to continuing on this discussion, and God bless.